Well, let's go ahead and get started. Thank you for being here this morning. This is a symposium that we've titled Utah at the Crossroads of the Mind, History and Philosophy at Midcentury. And I'm Jed Rogers. I'm with Holly George, one of the co-editors of the Utah Historical Quarterly, which is the state's official history journal. And the idea for this symposium stemmed from two articles in the forthcoming issue of the quarterly that we thought thematically it made sense to pair these two pieces together and to bring the authors here to this event. So in some ways, this event has already had the speakers baked into it, but John has also organized a panel that he'll introduce here in a moment. The two articles or essays that are forthcoming in the quarterly, one is by John Nilsson, who I'll introduce in a moment. It's titled Public Philosophy and the Idea of the University, the University of Utah's Great Issues Forum, 1952 to 1974. And in the same issue, we have a piece by Richard Saunders, who will speak to us later this morning. And his piece is titled Placing Juanita Brooks Among the Heroes or Villains of Mormon and Utah History. So again, it made sense for us to pair these two pieces and to think about the doing of history and philosophy in the mid-20th century. And I should say that the issue in which these two pieces it's not out yet. So if you would like to pre-order, there's a little clipboard that's going around, or you can see some promotional materials outside this room. Just a bit of housekeeping. I think the restrooms are down the hall, to my left, to your right. Oh, there's another one here. Okay, great. There's a little cafe down the hall as well. There's after the panel discussion, we'll have a little coffee break and refreshments, and that's to your left through these doors in the classroom right next door. And I should also acknowledge and thank various sponsors, I guess, or partners for this event, at least getting participants for the panel, as well as getting word out and for taking care of the refreshments. These include the University of Utah's Philosophy Department, the History Department, Continuing Education and Community Engagement, the American West Center, as well as the Marriott Library for allowing us to use this space. And in particular, I just want to thank John for helping with a lot of the logistics and for making this thing happen. So I'm going to introduce John now and let the panel go ahead and get started. John earned a BA in history from Brigham Young University, a master's degree in history from the University of Utah, and he did additional graduate work at the University of Washington. He's a native of Los Angeles, currently serves as the Assistant Dean of the Academic Advising Center at the University of Utah. So I'm happy to turn the time over to you, John. Thanks.
Thank you, Jed. Thanks, everybody, for coming on a cold Friday to talk about a very what for some people is a riveting topic, and for some people is not. I've talked to some of my colleagues about this, and some of them think it's riveting, some of them think it's not. I like it because I like to work in a place that's imbued with significance. When I walk around the campus, I can see echoes of these things that have happened in the past. I think those of us that are interested in history and interested in the history of ideas and intellectual history are interested in all of these things. And I see echoes of some of the things I'll be talking about today and that some of our panelists will be talking about in things that I encounter every day working in higher education. So I saw the intersection of several things happening here. I want to thank my panel for participating. This is a very distinguished panel. They have lots of honorifics, and if I try to go through them, I'll miss them all. We have Bruce Landesman on the far end here, who is an emeritus professor of philosophy at the University of Utah. I asked him to participate. I interviewed him for the article because he was one of the participants, one of the presenters at the Great Issues Forum, I believe in the later 60s and into the 70s, until the forum ended. And he's got lots of other honorifics. I'll say the same thing for all three of our panelists. Next to him is John Bennion, who I interviewed, who was an undergraduate during some of the time of the Great Issues Forum at the University of Utah. Went on to do a lot of great things in the field of education, superintendent of some of the most prestigious school districts, I think, Salt Lake City School District, Provo, Rochester, New York, right? And probably several others, and lots of other things, educational consulting, I'm going to miss a lot of things. Jack Newell, here, who is also an emeritus professor, education, honors, former president of Deep Springs College in California. All of these folks are published authors, and here to provide perspective on, I think, having known some of these figures and also being able to provide perspective on the evolution of higher education, which is one of the themes of this article as well. So what I want to do is, in about 20 to 25 minutes or so, read a condensed version of my article, and then we'll have John share some of his reflections on having experienced the forum as an undergraduate for about, I think, 8 to 10 minutes, and then Bruce will then speak from his perspective as a faculty member in philosophy. There was some drama going on in the department, I think, during the time. Intellectual drama, and then and as a presenter, and then Jack will then end the panel with some of his reflections on knowing these figures, as well as his perspective on where higher ed maybe was during this time and where it is now, and if we're the question I asked is, are we coming full circle to this idea? I titled this "A University for Utah" because the current president of the University of Utah, Ruth Watkins, has used that phrase and that tagline to talk about the other purposes of the University of Utah besides simply being a place for the instruction of undergraduates or even advanced instruction for graduate students, the other functions the university performs for the state. And the Great Issues Forum is one of those things, I think. So, to jump right in, from 1952 to 1974, the University of Utah's Department of Philosophy collaborated with the Extension Division, which is now continuing education, to assemble the best minds of the local faculty in the Great Issues Forum. In a series of lectures organized around a common topic, each year's invited participants addressed themes that would have resonated with students and the general public. Topics included such earth-shaking titles as The Nature of Man, Man's Survival, and the University in Crisis. The forum was designed to be engaging and accessible to the average interested layperson and to bridge the gap between the academy and the larger community. The lectures were well attended and often broadcast to thousands of listeners over local radio and reported in city newspapers. The forum was the brainchild of Philosophy Department Chair Waldemer Read. Read was the protege of the previous chair, Ephraim E. Erickson, who had himself studied under John Dewey at the University of Chicago at the height of Dewey's power and influence in American philosophical, educational, and reform circles. While Dewey was a confirmed humanist, his pragmatic philosophy was amenable to religious inflections, and it was this compatibility that Erickson found attractive. This ideological constellation would constitute a compromise for Erickson and Waldemer Read, his student, between the idealism of traditional religion, which treats the universe as the product of mind, and the realism of the natural and social sciences, treating the universe as existing independently of mind. According to American pragmatist philosopher Hilary Putnam, pragmatism functions, quote, as realism with a human face, distinguishing between a capital R realism that presumes the possibility of a God's eye view of reality and a more modest small r realism that recognizes the relativity of views contained within the universe. Putnam argued, along with other pragmatists, for a view of the cosmos that brackets the notion of absolute truth while commonsensically asserting the necessity of acting as if empirical science provides usable notions about how the world is constituted. In Waldemer Read's last contribution to the Great Issues Forum, he lectured on the nature of philosophy. Quote, the study of philosophy is just like any other study, except it is more thoughtful. The human mind is as effective as it is proved to be because of the social nature of its operation. Human thought is a cooperative work. I consider the thinking done by the professional so-called philosophers to be but continuous with human thought in general. Read had an optimistic appraisal of this societal learning process. He believed that the history of human thought was best viewed not as a fruitless guessing game, but rather as the gradual accumulation of data that made collective assertions about the nature of the universe more and more accurate as time goes on. In a sense, this understanding of the philosophical enterprise was the germ of the Great Issues Forum, but more importantly, was a microcosm of the idea of the university itself. The university as a cultural idea, and the University of Utah as an example of that, was a vital part of the societal search for truth. Other notions of the university might see the institution as, on the one hand, transmitting already discovered truths to a new generation, or on the other, as blindly groping in the dark, as equally unable to arrive at truth as any other past or current contender. But for Read and his colleagues, the university as a whole was indispensable in furthering human progress toward comprehending the nature of the universe. Armed with this understanding of philosophy and the role of the university in discovering and disseminating truth, Read and other academically trained philosophers created a public forum where previously taboo issues could be discussed in an open exchange moderated by faculty in the department and not by the university president or the downtown nexus of commercial and ecclesiastical interests. The University of Utah's Department of Philosophy self-consciously assumed a leadership role within the university in organizing these discussions, but also took a similar role beyond the academy to speak on behalf of the university on these topics. The lecture series also had another dimension. It represented the resolution of the secularizing movement that had begun in earnest in the university's academic freedom crisis of 1915. This crisis, in which the president of the University of Utah dismissed 4 faculty members thought to be disloyal to the school, set the university on a trajectory whereby it evolved from an institution deferential to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in the matters of the composition of its faculty and the subject matter it taught, to an institution that was perceived by nearly all to be independent of sectarian influence. The Great Issues Forum and the topics it covered and the wide-ranging publicity given to its programming illustrated that academic freedom. According to Ralph Chamberlain's Centennial History of the University, the 1915 controversy was sparked by Milton Seavey's valedictorian graduation speech, in which he urged the university to throw off its ultra-conservative shackles to become more broad-minded. Utah Governor Spry's presence at the commencement address and irritation with its inference that Utah could somehow be backward-looking led the governor to ask University of Utah President Kingsbury whether the student had acted alone or with faculty support. Kingsbury determined that several faculty had been aware of the content of the student's speech and terminated their employment. The majority of the student body signed a letter of protest to the president and were joined by protests from civic associations not connected with the university. The resulting national attention, joined with the American Association of University Professors investigation, which was their first investigation, by the way, led the Board of Regents to take action to replace Kingsbury. Allison Mower and Paul Mogren assert in their centennial study of the University of Utah's Academic Senate that the crisis was about freedom of speech rather than religion, and yet they're not mutually exclusive. While disrespectful speech acts were the initial reasons cited by the university for their abrupt dismissal of the faculty, the public perception of this was that it was at bottom motivated by religion, replacing critical faculty voices with compliant ones. The recently formed American Association of University Professors sent a committee to investigate the allegations that the academic freedom of the faculty had been violated. The report they issued largely agreed with the aggrieved former faculty and condemned the actions of the university president. The resolution of this crisis along the lines of the American Association of University Professors' recommendations for full academic freedom gave both town and gown what they wanted. The LDS Church could win respectability by pointing to their now hands-off approach to the university, and critics of both the church and the business establishment could wrest control of the university from those social groups. Under the next U of U president, John Whitsoe, and his successor, George Thomas, the administration would distance itself from direct church influence and advocate for neutrality on the campus. When asked, Whitsoe stated that LDS officials did, quote, not tell him how to run the U, except to ask on occasion that he employ a Mormon or two, end quote. For Thomas, who replaced Whitsoe in 1921, his 2 stated inaugural objectives were to improve the scholastic standards of the faculty and raise the scholarship of the students. Thomas's relatively long tenure, about 20 years, embedded these higher academic standards, including religious and political neutrality. For example, on the matter of political partisanship, Thomas believed the university should remain above the fray, saying, the institution is to serve all, irrespective of politics or creed, and it is difficult to engage in partisan politics, alienating the goodwill of your opponents. Work on the stump naturally means partisan discussions, and to the ordinary individual, to say nothing of the active opponents of the participants, it is difficult to differentiate between the activities of the individual and the activities of the university. It's tempting to conclude that Thomas felt the same about other institutions competing for the loyalty of his faculty members. Ephraim Erickson, who along with Milton Bennion, who's a relative of one of our faculty, one of our panelists here, comprised the fledgling philosophy department of 2 at the time. Erickson was accosted on campus by President Thomas in the 1920s when Ephraim Erickson was both a philosophy professor and running the LDS Church's youth program, the Mutual Improvement Association. According to Erickson's wife's account, President Thomas said, "Well, good morning, Erickson. How's the MIA coming?" My husband looked at him startled and said, "Well, fine. Yes." Thomas said, "You know, things would go quite far if you were spending as much time and energy and concern about the university as you do about the church." During his administration, Thomas instructed department chairs to attempt to keep a rough balance on their faculty between Mormons and those who were not of that religion, although this conflicted somewhat with his other injunction to choose the best candidate for the position. When LDS Apostle Widsoe, who attended the same LDS congregation as Thomas, noted that Thomas's church activity was restricted to dropping in on a Sunday school class once or twice a year and slipping out before the class ended, Thomas responded by saying he felt he could do a much better job as president if he did not identify himself with any religion. The origins of the Great Issues Forum lie in the period after Thomas and after World War II, when rapid growth in both student enrollment and faculty hiring coincided with the waning of the LDS Church's perceived ability to influence campus events. The philosophy department was uniquely positioned to fill the need for a flexing of the campus's intellectual muscles. Waldemer Read, Obert Tanner, Sterling McMurrin, and Max Rogers were among many who were former LDS seminary and institute instructors who went on to graduate study in some of the nation's finest institutions of higher education, such as Chicago, Stanford, and USC. McMurrin later referred to the department at the time as, quote, the intellectual hub of the campus, in the sense of attracting attention from university faculty, so other professors enrolled in courses and other disciplines enrolled in courses taught by the philosophy department, and taking a leading role in public intellectual life. Whereas in other American universities of this period, in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, philosophy was on the relative decline in terms of other more professional disciplines like engineering and business. At the University of Utah, at least in the perception of the university, was at its zenith. Waldemer Read initiated the Great Issues Forum, and its final year was dedicated to him in recognition of this. Believing philosophy was not confined to the ivory tower, but should be diffused throughout the community, he wanted a wide practical benefit to result from the teaching of philosophy. Read and McMurrin, for example, sought to offer advanced placement introductory philosophy courses in local high schools, but were turned down by the Salt Lake City School District before the time you were in charge, presumably. Okay, great. So this was an early advanced placement idea. The Great Issues Forum provided a space for the philosophy department to continue playing the role that most of them had played for the LDS Church as employees of its institutes and seminaries, that of a spiritual teacher or guide. In this, they were following the template of their pragmatist mentors of a generation earlier. The educated classes in the time of William James, around the turn of the 20th century, expected philosophy to reassure them about the worth of human life and the value of tradition, and to, quote, join mild exhortation with the defense of fundamental verities. George Santayana put it well when he said that the Cambridge philosophers around James had an acute sense of duty because they were conscientiously teaching and guiding the entire community, not just the university, as if they had been clergymen without a church. A dialogue on ethics between University of Utah professors with questions from the audience performed the same function in Salt Lake City in the 1950s that the Harvard pragmatists had in the 1870s. Both may have included audience members struggling to understand, for instance, the implications of taking Darwin seriously and wondering whether and how they ought to modify their own ethical practices based on new scientific understandings of the place of humanity on Earth and in the cosmos more generally. In its first decade, the themes addressed by the forum were more religious, ethical, and epistemological. They became more political and activist as time went on. For instance, the 1954-55 Great Issues Forum featured University of Utah philosophy professor James L. Jarrett's Does Philosophy Destroy Faith? They were just clearing the ground right in the beginning. Jarrett carefully considered the three terms of the question, as a proper philosopher would, and concluded that the risks of attending something like the forum are rather worth taking. He phrased the weakest version of the question as, do some philosophers and teachers of philosophy sometimes say something which might slightly modify some aspect of somebody's belief about some aspect of the universe? And the strongest version of the question as, do all philosophers invariably totally shatter the confidence and wholly overthrow the beliefs of everyone they meet? Rejecting both extremes, Jarrett helpfully formulated a more moderate position. For those who prize above everything complete orthodoxy, is there danger in studying philosophy in a secular institution of higher learning? Acknowledging a risk for the believer when the question is phrased in this more realistic way, Jarrett contrasts two scenarios. The so-called danger would be least in the case of a closed authoritarian personality studying, say, formal logic, with the teacher who in his church commitments is similar to the student. It would be greatest if the student is of a curious and open-minded turn, already somewhat disillusioned with his religion and skeptical of its claims, and the course is in the philosophy of religion, where the teacher is a religious liberal who believes that orthodoxy is the enemy of the good life. Jarrett's argument was likely framed in such a way as to allay suspicions in more traditionally minded university students that the purpose of the Great Issues Forum was to directly challenge religion in general and Christianity and Mormonism in particular. However, Jarrett's language was also jaunty enough to welcome participation from the campus community, who would likely have some of their ideas refined rather than replaced. The topic addressed on March 23, 1955 is also emblematic. Do history and religion conflict? This featured a debate-style presentation between Sterling McMurrin and Hugh Nibley, professor of religion and history at BYU. Nibley was well known as a philologist who attempted to vindicate Mormon truth claims by identifying parallel customs in ancient civilizations and those described in Mormon scriptures. Taking the negative side of the question, Nibley claimed that the premise of the evening was faulty. Quote, "The obvious intent of the question is to test religion's claims in the light of historical discovery. Or, as the newspaper phrased the question, can religion face its own history without flinching? There is no hint that history might flinch in the face of religion. The question proposes a beauty contest in which one of the contestants has already been awarded the prize." And he continues, "It is a cozy and reassuring thing for student and teacher alike to have our neat authoritarian college outline series syllabi of Western civilization, surveys of great minds and whatnot, to fall back on. But please don't point to these pedestrian exercises in skimming and sampling and try to tell me that they are a valid refutation of the prophets. If we have gathered here to read lectures to each other or to the Mormon church, we might as well spare our breath. Or if you are looking for a stick to beat the church with, my advice is, leave history out of it. It will come apart in your hands." In essence, Nibley urged the primacy of faith over secular scholarship, noting the weightiness or gravitas of the concerns of religion over against the mundane trivialities with which history concerns itself. In this way, Nibley somewhat echoed the mid-century trend of neo-Orthodox Christian theology exemplified in the work of such thinkers as Karl Barth, Emil Brunner, and Reinhold Niebuhr, who acknowledged the importance of the scientific method, but stressed the incomparably greater demand placed on the believer by the Word of God. McMurrin adopted the positive side of the proposition and argued that religious faith is undercut by the study of religious history. Quote, "It is the study of religion itself that occasions the most difficult and discomposing questions. It is when religion is studied and discussed seriously by rational, informed persons with open minds and honest hearts that it encounters its most severe testing. This is because one who is truly conversant with the history of religion has had more than a glimpse of the development of something that a large segment of the faithful supposed to be basically free from historical change." End quote. Among the difficulties posed by the study of religion to belief include human failings of religious leaders, the primitive origins of religions, the complexities and contingencies of religious origins, and the fact of change writ large. McMurrin charged apologetic scholars, presumably including Nibley, with hiding and distorting this history from the faithful, because admitting honest history, quote, would produce a different kind of religion, a kind which they do not like, that often makes people less amenable to authoritarianism and churchly control. One undergraduate philosophy major at the university who attended the event recalled how exciting the McMurrin-Nibley exchange was. He remembered the auditorium full not only with students, but faculty and the general public as well. The impact of the Great Issues Forum on undergraduates often was salutary, and I've parenthetically spoken with several more undergraduates since I wrote the article who've corroborated that it was exciting. The impact of that was far beyond the university. Not only was it the experience a co-curricular feast for philosophy majors, but students in other departments attended as well as part of the university's liberal education program. And in my research, I was finding that there were something that indicated you could get some kind of credit for writing up your experience. For many students, the forum assisted in the developmental process of sorting out the varied claims of reason, ethics, and faith. Professor Obert Tanner continued in a similar vein in 1957's forum. To separate myth from truth is an enormous undertaking. It becomes a large part of the work done by a university. This effort to distinguish truth from myth is the primary element of progress in all history of mankind. Referring to the endless warfare of truth with myth, Tanner said, there is, quote, some compensation. If truth were to finally prevail over myth, the humanities and social sciences would just about go out of business. Myth keeps many of us going, pays our salaries, and generally makes life quite exciting. Myth is at once our friend and foe. Without it, we would have to teach science or go into business. A horrible dilemma. And those of you may know that Tanner did go into business. Tanner queried the predominance of myth on the campus. Why is the population of this student body possessed of minds crammed full of explanatory and truth-claiming myths that will not hold up against scholarly investigation? He suggested 4 reasons for myth's success: life's harsh realities, usefulness of myth to leaders in keeping power and authority over those who believe, myth's easy alternative to faith, and the ability of myths to masquerade as ideals. Tanner ended his address by considering and rejecting a last-ditch defense of myths as helpful to society. Quote, there is no place for truth-claiming myths in a society sufficiently advanced to conceive and support free universities. Truth-claiming myths spring from primitive explanations. It is better to face life as it is, thereby seeking for ways to improve it, than to use the escape of believing what is an untrue interpretation of life. After what must have been received as a scathing critique of local power structures, Tanner suggested a positive method for separating truth from myth. Quote, as truth claims go by in review, I would ask, are you verifiable? And if not, are you probable? And if not, are you reasonable? Imagine all the casualties among truth claims, all those that are unverifiable, improbable, and unreasonable. Tanner's address illustrated several characteristic features of the University of Utah's mid-century approach to philosophy. First, it claimed a universal relevance and an applicability to the concerns of everyday life. Second, it elevated reason and evidence above intuition in the search for truth. Third, it did so publicly in dialogue with other participants, faculty, students, and community members in the audience. And there were many, many more examples of this. Waldemer Read, in the 1961 and 62 series, noted what freedom exists in the local culture, that every member of the philosophy department agreed that the topic of freedom necessitated a treatment of the status of freedom in Utah. He noted that civil and political liberties common in the U.S. were also found in Utah, and that Utah was also similar, on the other side of the ledger, in its lack of responsiveness to the dangers of Nazism and McCarthyism. Read identified freedom of thought as the most important of all freedoms, the one most likely to produce material improvement to humanity. Thought control expressed through psychological conditioning is what prevents many from realizing that the only sure-proof methods of testing a proposition's truth value are considerations of empirical fact and logical relation. The greatest tragedy of the state of affairs for Read is that the monotony of Utah culture in his time incapacitated its people to think new thoughts and contribute towards a larger national conversation on U.S. policy and the world more generally. This conversation for Read had a domestic component, which is both racial in terms of advocating for civil rights and economic in terms of Read's advocacy for labor unions, and an international component, which is mainly to do with issues of peaceful coexistence with the Soviet Union and the United Nations as an instrument of that peace. American philosophy was changing after World War II, and although the change was slower to arrive at the University of Utah than other places, it came nevertheless. A brand of philosophy that had shared antecedents with pragmatism, but was more informed by the precise formulations of a Bertrand Russell or a Wittgenstein, began to capture the imaginations of younger philosophers, newly graduated from PhD programs around the country. Termed analysis or analytic philosophy, this type of philosophy eschewed the traditional concerns of both American pragmatism and its European ancestors and focused instead on logic, mathematics, and linguistics. It saw philosophy's role not as asking and answering the big questions, but as clarifying the terms under which scientific investigation could be best carried out. As the historian Bruce Cooklick wrote, the classic American pragmatists had positioned philosophy as a central scholarly discipline. It spoke to educated disquiet about how the human condition was structured and provided to other disciplines expert counsel on how investigation might be carried out, or on the methods requisite for obtaining warranted belief. But analytic philosophers did not aspire to be public figures and were content with successful professional lives. Thus, philosophers began to write themselves out of subsidiary careers as what would become known as public intellectuals. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, at the U of U, most of the original group of philosophy faculty who had conceived and organized the Great Issues Forum had moved on. Their departure from the philosophy department's ranks decreased much of the impetus for offering these lectures and discussions, or at least changed the focus. Sterling McMurrin resigned from the philosophy department in 1970 to move to the history department. His resignation letter sheds light on the generational change. Quote, "Philosophy throughout the country and in our own department has turned toward a narrow, specialized professionalism. The Department of Philosophy is now a captive of a small but excessively aggressive and vocal element of the faculty. For many decades and until very recently, the philosophy department was everywhere recognized as a center for the dispassionate pursuit of knowledge and the cultivation of the instruments of reason. Much of what went on there was genuinely relevant to the lives of the students and the university and the community. It was an enterprise which produced authentic liberalism in the best sense of that word, a genuine contributor to intellectual freedom and social freedom, to which the university and community could look and did look for leadership," end quote. The newer philosophy faculty members were more interested in devoting their energies to rigorous technical conversations with their colleagues at other institutions than on local campus discussions about big questions. In addition, sociologically, whereas the older faculty were largely a product of Utah and interested in issues pertaining to ethics and religion, understood primarily through pragmatism, the newer faculty was from outside the state for the most part and embraced a different set of philosophical concerns, including analytic philosophy, and sometimes even more radical political stances than those they were gradually replacing, who thought of themselves as the liberals in the community. They were being outflanked to the left. And Bruce might talk about that a little bit. Including opposition to the Vietnam War and aggressively confronting university administrations. For the older generation, that was simply not done. A 1972 external review of the department concluded that the faculty were, quote, "all actively engaged in philosophical research and very much in the mainstream of American professional philosophy." This marked a profound contrast with the outgoing faculty, whose involvement in research and publishing in philosophy was actually relatively minimal and usually confined to local outlets, but for whom leadership of the university and engagement with the public was paramount. This was common to other universities as well. The divide in some ways between the academy and the wider public was less than it is now. This, combined with declining attendance among students, spelled the end of the Great Issues Forum after more than 2 decades. This shift in direction and loss of interest could also indicate that the freedom Waldemer Read so earnestly pleaded for was finally at last a reality in Utah. This shift reflected the forum's role in the secularization of the university. By the time the forum began in the early 50s, the university was ready to use the freedoms it had formerly achieved in an earlier era. By the end of the forum in the mid-70s, the university had achieved a seasoned maturity in matters relating to the local culture, well illustrated by an anecdote with which I'll close this part of my presentation. One senior university administrator in the period after the Great Issues Forum can recall only one incident where the relationship of the university and the LDS Church was put to the test. After a winter snowstorm, several fraternity members constructed a snowman, elaborately designed to resemble a particular Mormon apostle. A general authority of the church contacted the university president in outrage and asked him to do something about it. The president declined. So, now I've said a lot, but this is just based on research. You three have lived this experience. So, John, I don't know if you want to take it from here and provide your reflections. Thank you. I'll just stand here.
I was an undergraduate at the University of Utah right during the heyday of the Great Issues Forum. First from 1953 to 1955, left for a couple of years to be a missionary for the LDS Church in Germany, and then again in 59 and 62. So that was during the time when the Great Issues Forum was very, very visible, and for me, very exciting. And I'll give you just a little autobiographical data here to indicate why it was so exciting for me and such an important part of what I think was my undergraduate educational experience. As was indicated by John, my grandfather, Milton Bennion, and E.E. Erickson were the first to teach philosophy at the University of Utah. My father, when I was growing up for a time, was a supervisor of the LDS seminary and institute system, And that was at a time when that system was very open to scholarship outside of Mormonism. The church supported, in a number of cases, institute teachers going back to the University of Chicago to get their doctorates in religion and to study with people like Goodspeed, a very notable biblical scholar at that time back there. That was shut down pretty much when J. Reuben Clark came in as a member of the First Presidency of the church. And my father was very glad to get out and had the opportunity to become superintendent of schools in Salt Lake City at that time. So he was friends of Sterling McMurrin and Obert Tanner particularly. They were in a study group together, and when I was a teenager, my father would invite me to come in and listen to their discussions, which were always quite philosophical and always interested in church issues as well. I was fascinated with those discussions, and so when I started studying at the University of Utah, I was immediately attracted to taking philosophy classes along with other liberal education, general education classes. At first year or two, I had a class from Obert Tanner on philosophy of religion, from Sterling McMurrin on the religions of Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, James Jarrett, Introduction to Philosophy. And I was fascinated with those courses. I left high school a year early because I was kind of restless, and hitting philosophy at the University of Utah was just a very different kind of learning experience than I had in high school, and to me was intellectually very fulfilling. I was there at the time when Sterling McMurrin and Hugh Nibley gave their famous debate. It was in the then Student Union building, which is now the music school building, the big ballroom there. It was absolutely packed. And there was an air of great excitement. Both were very articulate and giving very different points of view on relationship between history and religious faith. And to me, that was more exciting than the BYU-Utah football game. And I think many students felt the same, at least those that I knew that were studying in the humanities and in the social sciences. I was also there when the topic of does philosophy destroy religious faith? I think Obert Tanner was on that panel as well, had a paper on it. And so after I got back from Germany, was very much inclined to major in philosophy, which I did, and got a minor in English picked up a teaching certificate. And when I was student teaching out in the Granite School District in English, my teacher mentor found out I was a philosophy major, and she asked me if I was interested in maybe doing a little unit on introducing the students to philosophy, which I did, and I found them very interested, and it was a very good experience for me. So when I graduated, I went to the Granite School District and proposed that I teach an introductory course in philosophy to high school seniors on an experimental basis. And unlike Salt Lake City at the time, they agreed and allowed me to do that. So I taught courses both at Granite High School and Olympus High School, and wrote my master's thesis on teaching philosophy to high school students whilst working on a master's degree in the history and philosophy of education. Waldemer Read was my mentor and my advisor on that thesis, and was very, very interested in what I was doing and what I was learning about teaching philosophy. I found many high school seniors quite ready and eager for that, a very different kind of study that philosophy represented than what they typically were getting in high school. A little anecdote about Waldemer Read. When I was a senior, I got involved in student government and was quite busy in doing that. So that frustrated Waldemer a little bit. He thought I was too involved in student government, not studying philosophy enough. So he told me one day, he said, you know, I think you're overly ambitious. I think you would like to have your statue on a pedestal in the park building there across from John R. Park. That still hasn't been filled, by the way. It's still there. And I did not succeed in doing that. In fact, it was not my ambition. But he chided me a little bit for deviating from the focused study of philosophy. I look back on those years with great appreciation. My study of philosophy was a great advantage to me, I think, when I got into educational administration. And I've appreciated very much my interest in ideas all my life. And at that time, the university, when I was going through as an undergraduate, was more parochial than it became. There were about 10,000 students. Most of the student body were LDS students. And there was a lot of interest in this interplay between religious faith and academic learning at the University of Utah. A lot of interest at the university, and a lot of interest, at least in parts of the larger community. And to me, as a product both of the LDS faith and faith tradition and a strong tradition of learning, which I also was imbued with in my growing up years, those great issues forums that in many ways sort of dealt with the interplay between religious faith in general and LDS faith in particular, and the university's focus on exploring truth claims and pursuing knowledge empirically and through rational processes. At that time, my uncle, Lowell Bennion, was director of the LDS Institute of Religion, and he had gotten a doctorate degree at the University of Strasbourg following his LDS mission in sociology, did his dissertation on Max Weber. So when he was teaching classes at the Institute, he was very much at home both in the world of the LDS Church and faith and the world of philosophy and the humanities generally. And he was very helpful not only to me but to a lot of people like me who were struggling some when they hit the University of Utah in a very different way of looking at the world and trying to understand the world, to sort of bridge the world of their faith and the world of their academic learning and the different methodologies that were involved. I've had people tell me that they stayed in the church because of old Bennion, because he just help to bridge that and come to feel that you can live in both worlds, and in fact both worlds can enrich one another. Because the university was much simpler then and far less diverse, these forums were among the few such lectures and gatherings at the university. Now, you can almost every day go to a lecture on this and that, sponsored by the Hinckley Institute and many other colleges and departments at the university. But in those days, there was much less of that, so that these great issues forums really stood out and were very well attended by a wide variety of people. And especially those times when they would bring a person up from BYU to interact with a professor here, so you'd get a different kind of interplay than you would if it were just two people at the University of Utah. And I think that it played a very important role, at least the time I was there. And I look back on it with great satisfaction and appreciation for the kind of experience that it was and represented, and how it added to my education that has been a great benefit to me to this day.
I think I'm going to stand up.
Yeah.
Should I come over there? Mm-hmm. I can have my seat.
Thank you.
You can't hear me well without this, right? No. Okay. How about with it? Yes? Okay. I arrived at the University of Utah to join the philosophy department in the fall of 1968. One of the first things I learned is that the department at that time sponsors a set of symposia during the year on matters of both public and philosophical interest, called the Great Issues Forum. I was intrigued by that and made it clear I would be happy to participate, and I did so a number of times. Now, I joined the university. Can I just put this? I joined the university after the heyday of the forum in the 1950s and early 1960s, when, as both Johns have told us, two Johns here, the forum was a notable event on both campus and in the city, attended by students, faculty, and non-university people. That was still the aim of the forum when I arrived, to involve students and a wider audience in discussion of significant issues. I remember the forum as drawing reasonably sized crowds during my early years at the university. Unfortunately, the size of the audience diminished over time, and by the end, about 1973-4, the crowd size was embarrassingly small. It was time to end the forum, and the department did so in 1974. So I'd like to express a few opinions about why the forum was so successful during its heyday, and here I think I'll be echoing things that both Johns have said, but also why it lost its audience as time went by. Louder. The philosophy department in the 1950s was led by people we've heard about, in particular Waldemer Read, Sterling McMurrin, Ober Tanner. I did not come so late that I missed them. I knew all of them, although not all that well. These people, as we know, were members of the LDS Church and had deep roots in the culture of Utah. They were also notable members of the wider community, well known in this city. And they were all quite interested in the connections and conflicts between philosophy, science, and religion. And they put together great issues forums that dealt with those connections and conflicts. In particular, they put together programs that would be of special interest to students and others who were religious, but wondering about how their religion fared intellectually in a world of developing knowledge. The forums thus appealed to students and faculty who, at that time, as I understand it, were to a large degree members of the LDS faith, a point that John Bennion had just made. I think this accounts for a lot of the popularity of those early forums. And I'm also guessing, and John has said this too, that there were not many other public lectures going on at the university during that period. If so, a Great Issues Forum lecture would be a major campus event, having few other events to compete with. In some, I think the topics chosen by the Great Issues Forum in that period were of special interest in this community, and there were few other events going on campus to compete with on the evenings that they occurred. So why did things change? Why did the forum lose its audience and ultimately have to be shut down? Well, let's think about the late 1960s when I came here. This was a time of great political ferment. The civil rights movement was well underway, and there were rising protests of the Vietnam War. During the year I arrived, which was 1968, a memorable year for those of you who remember it. In that year, Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy had been murdered. And there was a presidential election in November that led to an enormous schism within the Democratic Party, involving significant protests during the nominating convention held in Chicago. And many things related to those events were happening on campus. I didn't put this is in my paper, but there was an event in which something like 82 students sat in the Park building as a protest of the Vietnam War. Some of you may remember that. They were called, if I got the number right, the Utah 82. They were all arrested, but given the beneficence of our community, it was all done very peacefully and kindly. And there were also changes occurring at the University of Utah, making it more of a national and less a local university. Faculty from all over the country were being hired. And my guess is that there were more and more students also coming from out of state. So the predilections that gave the Great Issues Forum such prominence in this community were changing as the university developed and political issues dominated the news. The forum, I think, was a victim of these changes. So I've given you a bunch of hypotheses about the change in the university and the change in the times. I'm happy to tell that I am wrong about it. But before I end, I want to say a few words about the idea suggested to some degree in John's paper that the forum died because the philosophy department changed in a way that made its members lose interest in it. I don't believe this is correct. It is true, however, that the department changed. Sometime in the early 1960s, with the encouragement of the administration, I assume, the department expanded and added faculty members who came from far and wide. I grew up in New York City. In New York City, nobody believed there really was such a place as Utah. It was part of an interesting story to make life interesting for us who live east of the Hudson. Others came from the University of Washington, the University of Texas, the University of Colorado, and the University of Southern California. None of these new faculty members were members of the LDS faith. About that time, Waldemer Read and Ober Tanner had retired, and Sterling McMurrin had moved to the history department. It was a very different place from the place that both Johns have explained to us. The new members of the department were educated in the ongoing tradition of what has come to be called analytic philosophy, which started its development not in the 1960s, but in the very early part of the 20th century, with such figures as Bertrand Russell, G.E. Moore, and Ludwig Wittgenstein. It had a special spurt in the late 1940s and 50s, with work done by such people as Gilbert Ryle and J.L. Austin. This mode of philosophizing was increasingly technical and specialized. It was very different from the modes of philosophy that the people we've been talking about, Read, Tanner, and McMurrin, different from what they were comfortable with. So the department changed as its personnel changed. In fact, it became much like other philosophy departments in the country, including those in large state universities like the one I attended, the University of Michigan. In effect, the Utah Philosophy Department, and maybe the University of Utah as a whole, the philosophy department anyway, became more typical of philosophy departments and much less of a place with a largely local character. That doesn't mean, however, that the department lost interest in the Great Issues Forum. In fact, almost all the new members of the department were politically engaged and caught up in the movements of the time. And just a comment extemporaneous from what I've written here relevant to John's first paper. Many of the people who joined the department, main interests were ethics and political philosophy. There was lots of interest in metaphysics, in epistemology, philosophy of language, but for a very long time, the specialties of the philosophy department were the practical issues about how to live your life and what is a good and just society. The forum, so for the new people who were politically engaged and many involved in the kind of philosophical issues that warrant public engagement, the forum seemed to be an excellent arena for bringing to the community careful thought about the questions of the day facing our nation, and the topics of the 1970s reflected that. What went wrong is that times changed. The university was bigger and more cosmopolitan. Much more was going on, including frequent public lectures on all sorts of interesting topics. The forum was just one of many things and had to compete for an audience. So in conclusion, as I have said, the forum, I think, was a victim of the changing times, but one should realize times always change. Disciplines change, universities change, and what was highly popular at one time is less successful at another. And so I think, in conclusion, that rather than lamenting the end of the Great Issues Forum, and I'm not claiming anybody's really lamenting in some fundamental way its end, but rather than doing that, we should celebrate it for what it was, when it really meant something special on this campus and in this community. Thank you. Can you stand up?
Thank you, Bruce. Yes. Well, thank you, John Nilsson, for a well-researched and provocative paper. And my two former panelists, senior to me, I'm the latecomer in the group here. I arrived at the University of Utah in 1974, but I don't take responsibility for killing the forum. I came here as the whippersnapper Dean of Liberal Education, now we call it Dean of Undergraduate Studies. And at that time, offices like this were housed in the Park Building, so I was on the second floor of the Park Building. The Dean of the Graduate School was Sterling McMurrin, and his office was on the third story of the Park Building, immediately above mine. And my relationship with him developed over time, but my earliest encounter with him was that within a few weeks of my arrival here, I was interviewed by the Salt Lake Tribune about the nature of liberal education, the liberal arts and sciences. And I said something to the effect that this was the most important thing that students could possibly study at the university. And I got what I call my well now young man letter from Sterling. Instead of coming down to see me, he wrote a letter, and his secretary delivered it to my desk. And it said basically, don't ever make the mistake again, I advise you, of pitting liberal education against professional and other professional studies and the professional fields of endeavor, because these are essentially complementary and should never be pitted against one another. Liberal education enables somebody to become a much more wise and effective person as a doctor, a lawyer, or whatever they may choose to become. And in return, these professions provide an educational value to those who are imbued with the liberal arts and sciences, which enriches their lives, and these things continue to interact very positively. Sterling and I became very close friends over time, but I've always cherished that first encounter. Well now, young man, let me tell you, he and I were, I think, 35 years apart, occupying those two offices. Let me give you a little background, by the way, on academic freedom and how this incident that John Nilsson described fits into this history. In 1914, there was a sociology professor at Stanford University, which was in its early years, named Edward A. Ross. And he was a highly controversial sociologist, partly because he had decided to investigate the labor practices of the Central Pacific Railroad that was owned by and founded and built by Leland Stanford, the founder of Stanford University. He was dead, and so was his wife Jane, but this sense of obligation to the Stanfords was very, very strong indeed. So when E.A. Ross published a paper exposing what could be described only as very shabby labor practices of the Central Pacific Railroad, the trustees took umbrage and decided to take action against E.A. Ross and fire him. Now, academic freedom was something that was percolating all over the country as an increasingly sharp issue, as was highlighted here the next year at the University of Utah. But this seemed to be the issue that finally brought some of the academic leaders of the country out of the woodwork. And in 1915, early in that year, John Dewey, Arthur Lovejoy, and a variety of other very prominent American academics came together and formed the American Association of University Professors. They announced their declaration of the principles of academic freedom, which I won't go into here, but it amounted to the fact that a professor could not be fired without involving censure by the AAUP for pursuing their intellectual quest within their academic field without any constraints whatever. And the fact that actions would be taken against E.A. Ross at Stanford for opinions that he had, and by the way, some of them were racist and not to be admired at all, which it seems to me adds to the importance of what the AAUP did, and that is that I think many members of that AAUP founding group would have been fiercely opposed to much of what E.A. Ross stood for. But they did believe that he had a right to express his opinions. The unfortunate ones, by our language today, it would seem to me, as well as his being censured by the university for what he had exposed about Leland Stanford's labor practices. So the AAUP had come together. John Dewey was its president and or chairman, and they were ready to look at cases of violation of academic freedom. And as John Nilsson said very briefly, the University of Utah became the first exhibit. And so it was Kingsbury's firing of 4 faculty members, 2 in English, 1 in physics, and 1 in communication. They were non-Mormon young faculty members who had criticized him for his lack of respect for academic freedom. And there was no university senate at that time. It was born as a result of this incident. And they were just told that their contracts had been terminated and they would not be teaching at the University of Utah in 1915. This incident occurred in 1914 here. And so they immediately protested, and as John mentioned in his paper, women's literary clubs, the Alumni Association, 1/3 of the faculty resigned, by the way. All of the major student body officers resigned, and many students dropped out of the university. It was a protest that we could not imagine happening today over anything of this sort. The AAUP was apprised of this, and here is one of those little loops that it seems to me are extremely important. Remember now, E. Erickson, who was the inspiration for the Great Issues Forum, was hired by the University of Utah about 1920 in the wake of these events he was hired before this incident occurred. And as John Nilsson mentioned, Erickson had been a student of John Dewey. And so when the issue comes of the University of Utah's violation of academic freedom, it goes to the AAUP. They decide to investigate it, and John Dewey, no doubt, having been so close to Erickson, was prompted to choose the University of Utah because of this personal link with Erickson. So Arthur Lovejoy came out as the representative of the AAUP and interviewed members of the Board of Regents, Kingsbury, the governor. He was given amazing access to actors in this whole drama at the University of Utah and within Mormon culture, as it was then. And he assembled, after his 4-day visit here, a massive amount of information, turned it over to John Dewey, and it was John Dewey himself who wrote the 82-page report that excoriated the University of Utah for its lack of defense of academic freedom, its lack of due process provisions for faculty who had grievances with their treatment and the like. So that resulted in the University of Utah taking a strong stand at a very early time, actually, on behalf of academic freedom. Now, Sterling McMurrin believed that the University of Utah has a more vital awareness and keen defense of academic freedom because of this early experience, and that academic freedom actually thrives at the University of Utah to a greater degree than it does even at most other major American research universities, McMurrin believed before he died. Partly because, he said, the LDS Church had its own university to kick around down in Provo, and therefore they left the University of Utah some slack. George Thomas, immediately after the firing of Kingsbury over this incident and the censure by the AAUP, John Woodsoe was appointed as the next president of the university, and John Woodsoe either was at the time or shortly became an apostle of the LDS Church. So like Kingsbury, he was very much involved and very much connected with the LDS hierarchy and reflective of it. But when Woodsoe left in 1921 and George Thomas became the president of the university, things changed considerably, and it was his influence that resulted in the hiring of many of the foundational faculty that gave the University of Utah status as a legitimate, bona fide national institution of higher learning. George Thomas himself had grown up in Logan, Utah, under extremely difficult family circumstances. He was orphaned at the age of 10, I believe. And a high school teacher identified him as being a young person of great potential and said, "Why don't you apply for admission to Harvard University?" Out of the blue. Thomas did. He was accepted at Harvard, earned his degree there, magna cum laude, went on and earned his PhD at Martin Luther University in Germany, and came back to Utah, first as Superintendent of Public Instruction for the state, but even before that he was involved in reform efforts in education in his hometown of Logan. But suffice to say, in 1921 he was still a relatively young scholar. He was offered several federal positions of importance, and he wanted to become a professor. So he came here, and in 1921, and shortly after being appointed professor here, he was appointed president. So it was George Thomas then who launched a major effort to hire ranking scholars and people of great promise in the larger academic world, not necessarily with Mormon backgrounds. And so some of you will recognize names like Walter Cottam in botany, Louis Zucker in Judaic studies, Waldemer Read himself, Sid Engelman in history, Brewster Giesland in English. These are names that, at least when I was arriving at the university, were hallowed as professors who had come here and turned our sites to a much higher level. Now, thinking here of the importance of moving on to our question and answer, let me just reflect one further thing, and that is in terms of the span of time. So I've been at the University of Utah 45 years with a decade out to do something else. And I'm still teaching in the Honors College, a 2-semester course for Eccles scholars. 30 of these scholars when they're freshmen each year. And my aim with these scholars is very similar, I suppose, to what the Great Issues Forum was about. And that is, can I engage them in thinking about what kind of a human being they wish to become, kind of a society they would like to help build. But their composition, as a couple of our panelists have already said, were vastly different than than the students who came to the University of Utah during the era of the Great Issues Forum. So in the course that I'm teaching right now, there are 3 students with Hindu backgrounds, one practicing Muslim. About half the students embrace no religiosity or religious affiliation, whatever. And yet I still find them interested in many of the same issues as I was reading the topics of the Great Issues Forum that were approached there. That is, they are earnestly interested in hearing each other's perspectives on faith versus secular perspectives on life. They are interested in exploring why each other believe what they believe. They are interested in trying to figure out how we arrive at consensus, how we make our society work again, how we make government function positively. And I would say I owe something of a debt to those who were involved in the Great Issues Forum in trying to bring a very different composition of students to a vital engagement with the issues of forming a decent society and trying to prepare students who can lead with common decency in whatever way they choose to do that. Thank you very much, John. Let's go to the Q&A now.
So we have 10 minutes of anyone wants to share?
I understand there's coffee. So I will take some.
Okay. All right.
So I'm Matt Haber. I'm the chair of the Department of Philosophy now. So I feel like I probably should say something. Thank you for doing this. I want to echo what Bruce said a little bit about change and the way that we continue to reach people. I would love to do great forums now, but I don't have a lot of hope that we draw a big engaged crowd in that regard. But I think that it's the way we reach out has changed a lot. So this is an example. This week I gave a public talk on philosophy of, for, and in science up in Park City. I had another meeting this week about a public event we're building around February, around Charles Darwin's birthday, that philosophers will be involved in, and looking at working with Leonardo. So the way that we're trying to reach out now, I think, has changed a lot. And there's a really fascinating history there as well. So in some ways, the outreach has become more focused and smaller, but maybe we're penetrating in a different way. We're also now, I think, a big challenge on the university as we become professionalized and look more like our contemporaries. We see a lot of outreach to other departments. And how are we trying to just break through the disciplinary walls that have grown up around these different departments? And that's a big challenge across this university. And it's hard, if we can't even do that, it's going to be hard for us to reach out to the public at the same time. So I think there's still a lot of interest, there's still a lot of appetite for it, but it's changed quite a bit in what that looks like. And I think it's incumbent on us as faculty to try and keep our thumb on the pulse of what that looks like and how we effectively do it. But it's a real challenge, but it's fun. It's great.
I'm curious whether or not there is any connection between the Great Issues Forum and a slightly predecessor that was formed informally on campus in the 1940s called the Mormon Seminar. In fact, it involved many of the same people at the same time, but it drew people from all over the state, including a young man by the name of Leonard Arrington, who came down from Utah State to present occasionally, and drew people from BYU as well. Was there any sort of connection or cross-fertilization in those early years between those two?
I want to get to Matt's thing really quickly first, too. The current chair of the current E. Erickson chair, Elijah Milgram. So the E. from Erickson, the chair and endowed chair named after him. I wrote a book called The Great and Dark and a bunch of essays. And one of the points that he makes in that essay about not just the academy or philosophy in general, but about our society after Enlightenment is that it's difficult to fulfill the original premise of the Enlightenment that we can actually all be rational actors, make decisions for ourselves, because our society is not just specialized, we're hyper-specialized. We are in essence compelled to not be enlightened and to force on we are forced to rely on the experts. And we create separate distinct languages, and I think that's one of the points that the demise of the Great Issues Forum, I think, is wrapped up with that. There's a lot of things going into this, but it becomes increasingly difficult to speak across these different language worlds of different disciplines, even just history and philosophy, which are in the same general area, have separate kind of languages and ways of approaching things, ways of approaching text. So I think that's one of the reasons that it becomes difficult in the society to do that. Also, the lecture format is not the most engaging, right? And so even though these things had interaction, there was comments from the audience, there was back and forth. There are new ways of engaging each other as human beings right now that we could take a look at, right? So philosophy wants to engage people. Like, are there other media for doing that are going to engage more people? And then how do you do that across all these different specialized language worlds? The point that Richard makes about the Mormon Seminar is also called the swearing elders informally. I mentioned that in the article that's going to be published, so I kind of as an aside, there's no formal link between the two. In essence, what the Mormon Seminar was local faculty gathering people to talk about it, including people from BYU and the LDS Institute program, like Bennion would come and discuss. Bring in people like Juanita Brooks, who we're going to hear about very soon, and others who had things to say about specifically Mormon topics. Or one of the topics was the burned over district of New York. They would bring in someone who had done some original scholarship on that, and I think they would meet in the Student Union building, where the music hall, the music building is now, and have milkshakes or coffee or whatever people care to have. In that setting, in a very small setting, and then students began to want to come, and the professors were afraid the students were spies, and so they had to like keep the students out. And the UIA professors said, "We can't keep coming," and students come because they might be spies and they'll be fired. So, so that was that kind of thing. The Great Issues Forum, it was happening simultaneously. But the Great Issues Forum was addressing things in a much broader ecumenical way. But some of the same topics, so the nature of knowledge, nature of religious knowledge, these things were happening at the same time with the same personnel, definitely. Some of the same people participating in both. And this was just abstracting the issues they were talking about in the Mormon seminar to a wider plane of religion in general. Definitely, this is what's going on at the time. And this is before a lot of independent Mormon scholarly venues, right before Sunstone and Dialogue, the Mormon History Association, so before all that stuff. And then we've got like a couple of minutes until the break.
I'm sorry I missed some of the earlier comments, but I was remembering and reminded by some of the comments about an early program called Challenge Week back in the 50s, 60s. And these were lectures that it was kind of a national program, I guess, but they were well attended, were held in the Union Building, and a lot of classes at the university were suspended during this Challenge Week lecture period. It was kind of an exciting time, intellectually challenging, and I'm not sure how much of it involved the philosophy department, but it was kind of a university-wide program, and I think maybe a national program where these people were going from school to school across the country. I don't know if any of you remember that or can comment on that.
Did you participate in any of those?
No. I was just a kid at the time.
Just a kid, okay.
But excited by it.
And how long did this go? Until the 70s, or? I've never heard of Challenge Week.
Yes, it's several years, maybe.
So it was visiting scholars, or?
Remember J.E. Williams involved in political debates and that kind of thing.
And they would actually shut the university down. They would stop instruction for a week.
Well, it was since the students were going to the Challenge Week lectures, well, the professors kind of went along with that and suspended classes to cooperate with them.
I've not heard of that as an illustration of how fast things change and of memory. We have to keep records of this kind of stuff. I'll have to dig into that.
Still seems like a good idea.
I'm sure there'd be references in the student newspaper I could find. Yeah. Interesting. Okay, thank you for coming. I think we have food this way or this way? This way. This way. Okay, food is this way, and then 11 o'clock we're starting with entrance honors.
Yeah, we could actually start a little bit earlier than that, maybe take a 20-minute break or so. Okay. While this is getting up, thanks for those of you who are sticking with us through the end. Again, I'm really happy to introduce our next speaker, and for all of you to hear this presentation. This was originally in St. George as part of the Juanita Brooks lecture series back in March 28th, I think, this year. And it's fascinating for those of you who love history, who love the work of Juanita Brooks, and I think you'll find that the ideas that Richard presents here are really interesting. Richard is, just make sure I get this right, he's an academic librarian and former dean of library services at Southern Utah University. He holds graduate degrees in history from USU and the University of Memphis. And he's the editor of, among other works, 2 volumes titled Dale Morgan on the Mormons in the celebrated Kingdom of the West series published by Arthur H. Clarke. And he's presently hard at work on a biography of Dale Morgan, which is much anticipated by many of us. And he's also working on a study of post-war social and economic change in rural America focusing on several counties in West Tennessee. So I'll turn the time over to Richard.
Okay. I'd prefer not to use a microphone if y'all can hear me. Is that okay? Yeah. Good? Yep. Okay, good, because I'm a singer and I tend to blow things away when I have a microphone. Thank you very much. I will not find a good place to stand here. Let's see what my limits. Okay, I can do that. Thank you to Jed for organizing this and for y'all to come. I am a Utah native, but did not hear of Juanita Brooks until I was in college, and then started reading a number of things that I found very interesting, and very quickly she becomes the gold standard in some respects, a particular time and brand of storytelling. But I'm not going to leave this just in history. I'm also going to wind up with the part that you won't hear or won't see in the published article in the summer issue. I'm going to wind up with philosophy, because I think I have an answer, not the answer perhaps, but an answer to why the Great Issues Forum was launched, and also why it was falling away toward the end, as our predecessors took a look at. I owe thanks to a lot of people who made this story possible, including Leo Lyman and Chaz Peterson. Chaz Peterson, who introduced me to Dale Morgan, and to people like Bill McKinnon and Will Bagley, good friends of mine. So, one thing I forgot was the clicker. All right, we'll go that way. We sometimes talk about Juanita Brooks, and everybody knows who she is, so I'm not going to go through her biography. We sometimes talk about Juanita Brooks as a hero. But we spend less time trying to understand what makes her a hero. And that's one of the things that started making me curious, because here is this individual who started off as an English teacher and worked her career as an English teacher, who's known chiefly for her work in history. So if she's a hero, what makes her a hero? And if there's something about the time or the place, then there's something we might want to take a look at. Now, I think I'll give you the answer first, and the answer is she's a hero chiefly because she was an early pioneer of a new brand of inquiry that was new to her and new to the time period, but she got caught up in it, and because of that, and because she kept moving forward, because times were changing, she becomes a hero. Now, the important part is not that we call her a hero, but we understand what's changing at the time. So when we look, I'll go through that, and we go. Okay, there's Juanita Brooks. Yep. Talk about a heroic writer. So this is the question that I started asking myself. And if is it just Juanita Brooks? Is it something else that's going on around her? What's the action? And I think it's important for us to remember at least one thing, and that is heroes come out of conflict. They don't just grow up in a town. There's something that makes them into a hero, or that gives them an assignment as a hero. And it's typically not the person themselves. So what is it? But let's not ask a question in quite that fashion. Let's ask one more. What was the conflict? If there's a conflict, what was it, and who was involved with it, and what direction did it go, and how did it shake out? And there's a couple things that you have to remember too. There's a difference between the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And I want you to pay attention to that. Now remember, this was drafted for a general audience, not a specific audience, so you probably understand the difference. But this is important for understanding who Juanita Brooks is and why she is who she is. So I'm going to be talking about both today. Both the big D, which is now become among scholars the broad cultural, which would draw in the reorganization of the Strang Group and the Church of Christ Temple lot, as well as the folks headquartered downtown. The small d on the bottom there is the folks headquartered downtown. So when you see that, you'll see the difference in the way things work. I need to introduce a couple things as well. I'm going to have to stand over here after all, I'm afraid.
Would you like me to come up? I can be your clicker if you like.
Okay, why don't you? That wouldn't hurt. I want to toss out a term that most people don't hear. You hear the word historiography quite a bit, but much less the word historiology. And historiology is different than historiography. Historiography is the way history is written and how it's told and how it's published and disseminated. Historiology is something that doesn't get nearly as much press, but it's not really a branch of philosophy. It's more like a twig. But it's a useful twig, especially when you're trying to talk about what's going on in a culture, because historiology is the place that history itself functions within a culture. It's how and what can be told. So yes, it's philosophy, but it's a branch of philosophy that deals with the way that history is regarded. So I'm going to talk about historiology, but to do that, we've got to lay out a couple of timelines. Okay? The first part of this, I'm going to talk about Juanita Brooks herself and how she interacts and who she is, and fit her within a segment. Now, this is the Latter-day Saints with a big D, capital timeline, and I'm going to take 1935 as a beginning point. 1935 is when Juanita Brooks begins her interest in the writing about the past. The second part is 1950, and that's the publication of her first book, Mountain Meadows Massacre. Now, between those dates, that's where Juanita Brooks really becomes a hero, although she hasn't thought about it in quite those terms yet. The one thing we're going to do, we're going to take three different layers of this thing. We'll take some sections out of it again. I'm going to take this and look at it in a micro-historical sense. And then, one more time, I'm also going to take a little broader slice and take a look at it at Juanita in a macro-historical sense. And then we're going to go way up at the top, and we're going to do something that's looking down in a philosophical sense and to try and understand why Juanita Brooks is who she is and why she does what she does. One more time. I guess you could say we've got concentric timelines. Jed, do I need to bring the other recorder over here? Or put it in front of me?
Yeah, if you wouldn't mind.
So we're talking about a concentric timeline is kind of odd because in Western culture, time is linear. So concentric is a bit of a play on words because we're really kind of circling around the subject from three different perspectives. One more. So, one more. Macro history and hit it again. Now we're going to, and there's the layout of the way things look, kind of in a broader sense. So, in addition to just Juanita Brooks, we're also talking about her time and her culture, and then also this broader idea of intellectual debate and the way that things are happening. It's a fascinating study. It's a lot of fun, but it can be a little esoteric on the side. Need to introduce, in terms of microhistory, what's going on. Now, Juanita Brooks is from a small desert town, a place called St. George, Utah, down in the south. And she is she's a housewife. There's no other way around that. She's a housewife who has no real aspirations beyond wanting to be a writer. Now, it's kind of hard to be a writer in a town that small because there's not really very much to disseminate your writing with. So Juanita Brooks goes off to Columbia University. She picks up a master's degree and she comes back and becomes a teacher. Juanita teaching was interesting, but it wasn't nearly as important to her career as what happened after. Yes, she had a master's degree. Yes, she was qualified to teach at what was then Dixie Junior College. But that did not shape her as a writer or as a thinker that some later things did. However, she got in touch with a guy by the name of Nels Anderson. And if you haven't ever heard of Nels Anderson, it's no surprise. He has been neglected, I think sadly, by Utah culture, although he wrote one of the very most important books of the 1940s about the Mormons with a small d that happened at the time. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a bit. But Nels Anderson was a Columbia-educated PhD sociologist, happened to come to St. George first as a kid who was tramping around the country, worked out west on the railroad, came into St. George, went to Dixie Junior College, I think was one of Juanita Brooks' students, goes back to New York, to Michigan, then to Columbia, to University of Chicago as a PhD student, and ends up coming back to St. George in 1932-33 to do some field work to write about the Mormons, a scholarly work about the Mormons. Anderson was a brilliant mind, and interestingly enough, a copy of his autobiography, his own autobiography, did not exist in a Utah institution until last year. And I know that because I bought it and gave it to my library. Okay? So Anderson's an overlooked character, but he was very important. He started looking, Juanita made a connection about the same time with this other character, University of Utah graduate by the name of Dale Morgan. Now, Morgan looks like a young, fresh-faced kid. This is actually his high school graduation picture, West High, 1932. He ends up coming to the University of Utah, and Morgan's an interesting character mostly because he is completely deaf. He has no hearing at all. He's a postlingual deaf kid, lost his hearing at about age 14, which forces him into the written word and the written world. And something happens there as we go along through there. Both of these characters are important to Juanita's development as she moves along. Morgan is the one. Back up one. Morgan is the one who suggests to Juanita Brooks that, gee, you might want to write about this book, this idea. Now we'll get to this thing in just a second, but I'll tell you what. Morgan is the one who tosses out the idea of writing a book-length study on the Mountain Meadows Massacre. It wasn't her idea right off. Okay, now go ahead. So we have a couple of friends here that begin writing back and forth to each other, and we'll get into some specifics again. Hit it one more time. But we've got to put it into a context. So we're going to take the timeline and break it down into smaller bits. And I'm going to tell you the story of how Juanita Brooks became a heroic writer, or becomes a heroic writer. 1935, she publishes a couple of short essays in a national magazine, Harper's Weekly. And they get some pretty good attention. She's a good writer. There's no question. She knows how to tell stories, and that's the most important thing. But that's not the same as being a historian, and that's not the same as being a historic writer. She's just observing and telling the story that she knows about. 1936 and 1937, she makes two interesting discoveries, first-hand accounts of the Mountain Meadows Massacre. The first two first-hand accounts ever discovered were Juanita Brooks. Now, she had heard about this. It was an open secret in St. George. Everybody knew about the massacre. Most families had people that had been involved around the edges or lived around the edges. Juanita Brooks knew one of the perpetrators personally. And if you want to read that story, you want to take a look at Peterson's biography, where he gives a very good detail about her introduction to the Mountain Meadows Massacre in the person of Nephi Johnson. But in 36 and 37, you don't talk about the Mountain Meadows Massacre. That is not allowed. That's culturally dangerous territory. So she waits until about 1940. And in 1940, she comes to Salt Lake City, and based on the two discoveries she has made, makes a presentation, a verbal presentation at the Utah Academy of Sciences, Arts, and Letters, describing these two new discoveries, and wants to publish them, and says, that's culturally perilous. I'm not going to do that. So instead, go ahead, one more time. Oh, back up one, sorry. 1938, that's when Morgan was hired by the Historic Records Survey, one of the WPA programs, and was being introduced himself to history. He was an art student up here on campus. He had planned for a degree or for a career in commercial art back in the day when copywriting was, ad writing was a thing. He couldn't make a go of it. Nobody would hire him in Salt Lake City. He was hired as an editor for the Historical Records Survey, and for several years begins his own education in history. 1939, he was handed a task of writing about Washington County and began corresponding with Mrs. Brooks, and the two of them soon very quickly discovered they are very interested in what might be there. Now, interestingly enough, in October 1938, only about 2.5 months after he'd been hired by the Historical Records Survey, after he'd been introduced to history, Morgan writes a cousin that there is almost nothing in Utah written about the Mormons that's worth anything. I'm glad you caught that. Most people in St. George didn't get it. 2 months, brand new college student, and he's now challenging professionals who have ostensibly known what they were doing, people who had grown up in the culture. That's important. Between 1939 and 1941, that's the next one, Morgan and Brooks write back and forth, begin writing very frequently back and forth. Now, none of those letters survive. Unfortunately, nothing. You'll also see Juanita Brooks' letters out here. She didn't keep any of her correspondence. He kept none of his correspondence before 1941. So it's an unknown quantity. But they became very, very good friends, even though they hadn't met each other. They were pen pals, I guess you could say for the time. 1941, Dale makes a trip down to St. George on business and meets Juanita Brooks for the very first time. And they have a very interesting relationship thereafter because he can't hear and she can't talk and drive at the same time, right? Because you're facing the wrong direction for the person in the seat. So their whole relationship, almost whole relationship, is based on letters back and forth between each other. And they're great letters. They are great letters. Dale, one more time, obviously World War II happens, okay? So things are starting to pick up. One more. 1942, they meet again, and Dale starts, Juanita says, look, I really want to write on this, but I can't do it. How do I structure this? And Dale says, well, you've written for Harper's before. Can you structure it as an essay? And so she sends him for the first time a draft of an article on the Mountain Meadows Massacre. And Dale takes a look at it. One more. Dale takes a look at it in actually that's when she sends it to him. One more after that. 1943, a full year later, Dale returns it to her with a manuscript critique. Okay, now, in between, one more, he has moved to Washington, D.C. So part of the reason is he has just simply moved across country and has to find work and is working for the federal government. That's why it takes a year for him to critique. But he says, look, you've got way too much here for an article. You can't do it as an article. And, more importantly, you've got to decide how you want to approach this story. If you're going to tell the measure of a massacre, it can't be just a story. You've got to have proof because your ideas are contradicting the received wisdom that's coming along. So he sends her back several pages of an outline saying, here are the questions you have to answer. Here's the things you have to do. He introduces her to things like footnotes. She'd never seen a footnote before. He introduces her to scholarly bias. He introduces her to narrative structure, more than just storytelling. So in this whole process, as Brooks is beginning to think about the massacre, she's also getting a first-hand tutorial in historical writing. And she's getting it from a kid who's just about young enough to be her children. One more. 1945, she's taken 3 years to write this book and rewrite it for the first time. She sends another draft back to Morgan. Morgan sends it back with about 8 pages, single-spaced, edge to edge of the paper with criticisms and comments on it. So she goes back to do it again. A third time. One more time. Now, importantly, the war ends. And why is that important? Because there is a major shift in American thinking. American cultural thinking that happens at the end of World War II. And you don't see it, and I don't see it, and the people on the ground don't see it, but it's very real and it happens. What happens when GIs come home? They are no longer interested in conflict. They're interested in nice, stable, family life, mainstream American things. They don't have to go to the South Sea Islands. They don't have to go to the shores of France. They don't have to have people shooting at them. They want calm, quiet, cool, collected stuff. That's kind of what's happening, is that Brooks may have gotten out of her topic. Not quite, because on the heels of that, almost there, on the heels of that, there's the Pioneer Centennial, Utah Pioneer Centennial, 1947. Okay, so those two things connecting together are really important. You have a desire for stability and calm, cool collectedness, and you have a pioneer, a major cultural centennial memorial event. What does that create? I'll show you in just a minute. 1948, Morgan moves back to Salt Lake City from Washington, D.C., and very quickly the two of them meet. In fact, Juanita comes up to the city bringing some people and specifically looks up Morgan, and she and Vesta Crawford and Dale Morgan, Vesta's taking the picture, they climb in the cars and they drive around the canyons of Salt Lake looking at trail information and early Mormon stuff just because they've never had a chance to do it before. Okay. 1948, she also sends him again a third major revision on her book, or what's now becoming a book. And Dale then takes her very carefully, line by line through this thing and says, you're going to have to answer this or do this, and you need to change this, you've got bias here. And then they meet again that summer, but it's Morgan by this point who says, okay, now you're ready to approach a publisher. Who are you going to get? She says. So Dale says, I know some people, let me do what I can. Morgan is the one who writes a friend of his who is now at Stanford University, a guy by the name of Stegner. Has anybody heard of him? Yeah. Writes to Wally Stegner and says, what do you think? You've never heard of Juanita Brooks, but here's somebody that I think has got something substantive. Stegner says, well, he's actually shopping around for Houghton Mifflin. He says, no, you got to have someone that's unimpeachable as a press and that's outside of Utah, that can't be affected by social pressure or economic pressure within the state. So Morgan says, all right, well, I'm going to go to Stanford. So he recommends to Juanita Brooks, she sends his manuscript to Stanford University Press, who in 1949 does exactly that. And then, one more time, I'll skip that one. We get Mountain Meadows Massacre, okay? In between 1935 and 1950, Juanita Brooks has become a different person. She's taken a huge emotional and cultural risk. She's taken it at a time when stability is really important to the culture she lives in. And she's done it in print, outside Utah. That's a challenge. And she's very worried. She is frankly very, very worried. Because there's a couple of other things that happen. There's also another book, and I think I got it up on this one. Nope, there's not. Okay, I'll go to this one. These two friends really have a symbiotic relationship. On the one hand, Brooks has talent, she's committed, she's an insider. When you talk in cultural terms, she knows the lay of the land. She knows what it's like to function and write within Mormonism. Morgan, who also grew up in Mormonism, has stepped out of the culture, has something else. He's got the idea of sources. Now, when you look at Juanita Brooks' book, when you look at Mountain Meadows Massacre, one of the things that you'll notice is there's an awful lot of stuff from Eastern institutions. Juanita saw none of it. All of that material was handed to her by Dale Morgan. So when you look at Mountain Meadows Massacre, you're really seeing the work of two minds. You're seeing an incredibly good researcher and a critic and a mentor, and then you're seeing the person who understands things on the ground. Now, Dale was perfectly happy for her to take all of the credit, even though it really was the work of two minds. That was just the way he did that for dozens of people. He didn't need the credit himself. He was happy to let her have it. And it worked. Okay? What did Brooks get? Well, she got some tutoring and mentoring, as I mentioned. And Morgan got someone to encourage. Now, remember, this is a single man at the height of the war, working in a not quite faceless bureaucracy, but not a whole lot of personality in wartime Washington, not a place that he could really connect to. It wasn't home for him. Juanita Brooks really became for him kind of the touchstone to a Utah that was past, the past that he knew was starting to drift away. But it's not until later years that he could really express that. But that's what he got from that one. Morgan got someone to encourage. Okay, so this is not just a one-way street. It's not how Dale Morgan made Juanita Brooks into something. It's really how the two of them interacted and created themselves in the process. One moment. All right, now, that's kind of it on a micro-history level. That's the nuts and bolts on the ground. But what's happening? They're working within a past. They're working within a present. And they're doing it at a time and in a place that is very, very real. It's not exactly the same places as other places. It doesn't have the same culture. It doesn't have the same people. It doesn't have the same expectations. What does it have? Well, can you see where she's heroic yet? A little bit, maybe? Well, all right. Well, I know you do. But I've told you this story for years, so. Okay. Let me go into macro history, and let's talk less about the two actors, and let's talk about the cultures that they're working within, in Utah and in Latter-day Saint history. Okay? To understand Mormon history of the time, you have to understand the way it was worked. LDS narrative existed within a specific type of storytelling. Okay? Whether you were dealing with history, or whether you were dealing with theology, or whether you're dealing with anything else, you were dealing with a specific kind of approach. Now, outside of Utah, there was not a whale of a lot of interest in Mormons or the culture, or in Utah generally. There were a few exceptions, but most of them were not. Most of the rest of the country didn't have any interest in the Latter-day Saints. That began changing at about this time. Okay? But as the Mormons wrote, it was for Latter-day Saint audiences. Now that'll run by itself. These are the kind of works that were offered up to Utahns about their history and about their past and about their world. It was written to congratulate the founders. It was written to gild the founders, I guess it was, but certainly to reinforce values and to reinforce ideas. And as that happened, history had a purpose. The past had a reason for existing and being told in the way that it was told. The problem was that history, especially, was tangled up with church authority at the same time. When you told the story of the past, you had to rely on those who had been in authority to tell the story, because they had been the actors in the process. Now, there's always a problem when you have to go to one source or one group of sources to tell the story, to tell any one story, because you deal with bias. But more importantly, you deal with purpose. What's the reason to tell the story? So, no, let it sit there for a second. Okay. Yeah, we'll get to that in a second. Primary material at that point was very, very limited. I didn't put up any photographs of the church historian's office. But Utah collections and Mormon collections simply did not exist. There were no research collections. The University of Utah did not have a Mormon collection at all until the 1950s. Their State Historical Society, which had been actually created largely by Morgan and by his idea, was the only thing that was even marginally accessible. The only collections were private collections. So if there is no source material, where do you have to go? Well, no one really knows. So the challenge became, how do you do it? Now, remember, we're talking about a particular type of storytelling and a particular time. Here's a couple of images that give you a graphic sense of the time and the place and the view of history. Okay, and what do you see there? This is the audience interaction part. Okay, these are both centennial programs. What do you see? Heroes, absolutely. Guys in bronze, right? Obviously, Brigham Young stood there neatly dressed in his Sunday best, even though he just come 1,200 miles in a wagon in the open. And he said, this is the place, right? Flanked by his two counselors. Now, ignore the fact that he was actually laying in a wagon sick when it happened. Okay? This is the way we remember. Remembering is shaping. Now, what's on the other side is the Centennial Souvenir Program. Now, has anybody ever walked across the planes, packing stuff? Okay, no real experience. I can tell. I shoot a .50 caliber Pennsylvania flintlock rifle. That's not how you carry a gun. Okay, it's too bloody heavy. But that gives you that. Oh, the other one is this one. You love this? This guy right here's got what in his hat? An eagle feather. Why? He's conquering the West, yeah, maybe, but doesn't that smack of Indianness? That's what we do today to demonstrate how outdoorsy we are. But not at the time that the Mormons were coming across. That would make you look like a Native American. That's not a good thing to look like. So what you have in both images is a way of using the past to do what? To tell a present story. Okay? When the Latter-day Saints were writing, especially around the centennial, I'll get to know one more in just a second. When they're writing the centennial, when they're having the centennial, they have a purpose in mind. Okay, now it's time for the next one. Now, this one's good. This one is contemporary storytelling as well. What do you see in this image?
It's the seagull story.
It's the seagull story. Yes, there's only one seagull story, by the way, right? Yes, there's only one. And you can see in these things, you've got both. This is one float out of the parade float. On this one, you see Utah and Idaho Sugar Company. On the one hand, you've got the seagulls and coming to eat the grain, which is glorious. And then on this side of the float, the front of the float, mind you, what do you see? Can you see that big, tall, standing up thing?
Corporate Mormonism.
It's corporate, well, it is literally corporate Mormonism. In this case, it's the seagull monument. But more importantly, you see there's a woman, it's always a woman, okay, teaching whom?
Children.
Teaching children to do what? Look at the past, folks. Look to the past. These are your heroes. These are who you should emulate. Right? Now, this is built culture and a whole bunch of kind of other folkloric stuff like that, but this gives you an idea of the way that history functioned in the 1930s and 40s when Juanita Brooks is starting to learn her craft. Now, how well do you think the Mountain Meadows Massacre would fit into that scheme? Not very well. Okay, one more. So where does it fit? How does it work? Well, I forgot to mention, how many people has anybody familiar with the hymn written for the centennial, They the Builders of the Nation? Okay, they the builders of the nation, blazing trails across the way, stepping stones for generations were their deeds of every day. And then there's another part that says, building new and firm foundations, pushing back the wild frontier, forging onward, ever onward, blessed, honored pioneer. Okay, great. There's also another verse that says, every day some burden lifted, every day some heart to cheer, every day some hope the brighter, blessed, honored pioneer. Is that kind of a high bar? Okay. Do you have, in your lifetime today, are you every day doing that?
Yeah.
Well, then you're better than I am. Okay? A few of us have down days. I suspect that the pioneers might have had a few down days as well. It might have been hard even. They might have sworn at the cattle occasionally. But that doesn't fit the image. And it's the image that is teaching the rising generation. This is the post-war world trying to look for something that is disappearing quickly. There are still pioneers floating around, but they're getting older and older, and they were younger and younger at the time, and pretty soon they won't be there. So what do you do with it? Well, that's important because what this makes, what that image or those images makes, back up one. What those images do is they create an us. They create a culture to which you or anybody else can belong. Now, in my writing on American civil rights topics, I tumbled to a very interesting piece of sociology that talked about in-groups and out-groups. When you look, back up one more. When you look, that one. When you look at this puts a boundary around Mormonism and Utah culture specifically, right? Okay. Does this apply to Nebraska or Massachusetts or even Idaho? Not really. It's specifically right here. It's us. Us that is excluding everybody else. Okay? That's different. That's a little different than the way that history works sometimes. Okay, so. Okay, let's go past that one and into the next one. Okay. 1969, there was a Swedish sociologist who was on a Fulbright scholarship, and he published this particular article. It's a very short essay, a one-page essay talking about something that was happening. Something was shifting and changing within Latter-day Saint culture. And he calls it the New Mormon History. And he points out to a number of things, and you can see some of them here, but I want to emphasize a couple things that are in this. Hit the button again. Okay? There's a change and a shift. You don't question pioneers, right? You just don't do that because that's your goal, that's your emulation. But here, his name's Moses Rishin points to something that has shifted in the culture. 1969, Mormon religion and its history are subject to discussion. That's a radical thought. Okay? Another one. Okay? Any particular feature of Mormon life is fair game. That's also a radical thought in this new version of Latter-day Saint history. One more. Right? Without rejecting the divinity of the church's origin and work. Okay, can you see something has shifted between 1950 and 1969? That's important. It's not perfect. Now, this kind of stuff is coming up, and there has something happened between the 1930s and the 1960s that provides a foundation for this change to happen. One more time. And that's the idea. Well, this is Rishin's work. And he identifies things like that. But I want to concentrate on the preceding generation, of which Juanita Brooks is one, and a very important case. And Dale Morgan is one. Now, these are some of the works, get it one more time, that I want to concentrate on. So we'll leave the New Mormon history aside and talk about the foundation of this stuff. Okay? Keep going. So the New Mormon history is a new way of looking at things. When you start looking at people like Juanita Brooks, she does what? She writes from inside the culture, but who's her audience for Mountain Meadows Massacre? It's not Latter-day Saints. It's everybody else in the country. She's writing for an external audience. Where is she publishing? Stanford University, which is not a church press. Okay? Not a church press. She's only one of a number of things, launch it, that start looking at history in this new fashion, in a different way. Now, some of these look sort of the same time. The earliest one that I identify is Dale Morgan's own work on the state of Deseret, the predecessor to Utah. Morgan actually writes to Bernard DeVoto and says, by this point, Mormonism really was compounded out of the lives of hundreds and thousands. There is more to Mormonism than the lives of Brigham Young and Joseph Smith. Okay, you're getting a reaching down into history. Rather than gilding the founders or isolating the hero or putting the pioneer on the pedestal, Morgan's looking down and seeing what's the action of just the normal people. These writers start asking similar questions, but they do it for audiences outside Utah. What's the purpose? There's a different purpose. Now the problem is, this kind of approach begins challenging the master narrative. Now, a master narrative, in a cultural sense, is the myth or the founding story that everyone accepts. The pioneer myth was well entrenched in Utah. But what happens when you have someone who's not giving you the myth? What do? You have what? You have a conflict. Now do you see where Juanita Brooks fits in? Okay, Juanita Brooks was one side of the conflict. It creates a tension or a collision. It gives something out of which there has to be a contest. Hit it again. So I think when you look at things, there really is there's a challenge between this older view of history and a newer approach to history, an older approach and a newer approach. On the one hand, go ahead. Latter-day Saint history of the 1930s through the 1960s, really, was published within, it was published internally. It belonged within Utah, mostly Utah. What else? New Mormon history was on the outside. It was written for a different reason. What else is happening? It was written for insiders. It could make assumptions because the readers understood what was going on. You can't do that with an external readership. You have to explain and justify, to some extent justify, at least provide a context that you don't have to provide for an internal reader. More importantly, that earlier form of history was based very, very, very heavily on personal witness and personal remembrance and memoir and narrative and those kind of things, okay? Not as much on documentary evidence. Now, you don't question a church leader who is remembering what it was like to be at X, right? You just don't do that because they were there. Now, I have my own experience. I have a second great grandfather who was the first people into Cache Valley, and he tells a story that cannot be documented in any other source. So who's right? That's the kind of a challenge that you have when you're dealing with an insider culture, outside culture. The New Mormon history was looking for things that were true, that were factual, that were demonstrable, documentable. It was factual and evidentiary. It was built in the way that other people who weren't familiar with the culture could say, I can see this because I can see your sources and evidence. On the other hand, the older one also had a measure of truth to it. It was also culturally true, but it was true in a different sense. It was engaging with the community at large. It told the story that allowed the culture to perpetuate itself. And that's important. On the one hand, the new style was context, trying to explain, trying to find a basis for things. On the other hand, you have nostalgia. Okay. Now, are they the same? Another interaction here, folks. Okay. No, they're not. They're different purposes. Are they right or wrong? Well, there are challenges in both senses. Go to the next one. Now is where we get into this larger part, and this is where we start putting some context into stuff. What's really happening here, I think, in the 1930s, 1940s, continuing into the 1950s and 60s, but especially the 30s and 40s, from my perspective, is that there's something we have to keep in mind. History is never about the past. Never. History is always about what? And this is a trap. Go ahead. Fall into it.
Now.
It's about right now. Historians don't write for dead people. They don't read and they don't buy books, right? Okay? They don't buy much. They don't buy on Amazon. It's writing for living readers. And that's important because that means every time we tell a story, it's written for a new generation and a new purpose and a new approach. That's why there are hundreds of biographies of prominent Americans, and they keep coming out. How many George Washington biographies are there? Or Lincoln or anybody else? Because there's always a new need. There's a new generation to educate and to inspire. Okay? History is never about the past. James Baldwin, who was a writer, black writer of the 1960s, said something that is really important. And it talks about this idea of the past. And he said this in a debate with, Cripes. Who's the God man at Yale?
William Buckley.
Thank you. He did it in a debate in London with William Buckley, or Oxford with William Buckley. He makes this statement, that the history is never about the past. It's always about now. And that's what was happening. There was a conflicting view of what has to happen now in terms of storytelling among the Latter-day Saints. One more. That introduces a new word a really important word, a philosophical word to the study of history called presentism. Now, presentism is a polite word. There are other words that are sometimes bandied about. One of them, utilitarian. Okay? There's a purpose for it that you are trying to shape or direct. Well, yeah, that's the way writing is, right? But presentism means that there's a cultural need for this work in this form. There's a use for the book that I'm writing. When you look at all those ones that scrolled through on the screen that showed the Latter-day Saint works, all of them were intended to do what? To inspire, to motivate. Okay? Less so in Great Basin Kingdom. You can't do anything with that, right? It just is. Keep going. Now, lest you think this is past, presentism is alive and well. And it's not only in Latter-day Saint cultures. Now, a couple you can see on there. The Work and the Glory, which is my very favorite whipping post. And a quote from, and we still do reenactment, right? How many people still have every once in a while you go and you take kids out on a trek to give them a taste of what's going on. Now, first off, if you're walking across the plains in the 1840s, you're not following a road, right? Roads are smooth. Otherwise, you'd be hiking through that brush. It'd be a different experience. But importantly, notice what Thoreau says about ideas. It doesn't matter what the story is. It's what you bring out of it that matters. Okay, one more. The flip side of that is historicism. And historicism, another philosophical term, deals with the past as it is. Okay? If you look at it today, you can consider things like the Joseph Smith Papers Project. That's a sea change. It represents a sea change in perspective of the way the past is appropriately told. Now, yes, there are still people writing the Work and the Glory, or things like that, and there always will be. But this is something new. One more. Okay? This is a German phrase, which those German speakers among you, I will not embarrass myself by pronouncing it. But it was, this was the phrase that was pulling up ideas that said, look, let's cut through all of the myth and the storytelling and the assumptions and tell things as exactly as we can, re-render. Now, on one hand, it's called objectivity. Ranke tried to, and this is his phrase, Leopold von Ranke, who really comes up with a modern approach to history in the 1850s. He tries to get things as they really are. Now, it was twisted and taken differently by historical writers later, and they tried to say that pure objectivity was possible. No, it's not. There's always a purpose to it. But what Ranke was trying to get at is the idea of getting beyond authority, and let's look at actuality. Let's look at reality with a small r. So what we've got with Juanita Brooks and her generation and how she fits into history is really a conflict between these two forms of narrative and storytelling. There's a purpose behind both of them. The problem is that they're different. On the one hand, presentism wants to give something that's useful to a culture, something that they can identify with. The great problem with that kind of thing is that you can only tell presentist history by omission, by leaving out uncomfortable facts and concentrating on the story that you want to communicate. Okay? It leaves itself open to wide criticism for being incomplete or unfair or biased, and it's intentionally biased. That's why it's written. On the flip side, historicism has its own bugaboos, and Juanita Brooks falls into a couple of them. Historicism takes a look at things as they are, but there's no reason to motivate. All it is descriptive. There's nothing in it to inspire or direct. It just describes. So on the one hand, one is over-emotional. On the other hand, one is over-rational or over-reasonable. And as a result, both of them have flaws. Now, they both have purposes, but they also both have flaws. One more. So, let me go back to two friends. couple of friends writing in the 1930s and the 1940s. They eventually drifted apart, as many friendships do. They remained good friends to the very end. However, they didn't write as often as they would like to have, I think. Brooks goes on to be a noted figure in Utah history, frequently coming to Salt Lake City as a guest lecturer, as a speaker, writes the history of Jews in Utah, does a number of other things that are really significant. Morgan, however, makes a shift, leaves Latter-day Saints behind, not by choice, but by fate, I guess, as much as anything else. And he becomes one of the great minds of the fur trade history and overland narrative history. Interestingly enough, a young scholar by the name of Leonard Arrington one time approached Morgan. In fact, it was Morgan who Leonard Arrington went to for criticism in the early 1950s, because Morgan was unassailable as the expert of the time. Wallace Stegner once wrote Morgan that he was looking forward to the time where he could critique one of Morgan's books and find an error, so he could tell his grandchildren that he had found an error in Dale Morgan. Okay, that's the scope and the scale of these characters. So we have a person who has become a giant for taking a new and untried path through the narrative of the past. Okay? Juanita Brooks fell on the side of historicism. Now, again, nobody is ever pure one way or the other. But because of that, she became a hero. She became one of the early figures to do so notably and openly. And that is why she is a hero. That's why she's a hero, and that's why she's among the heroes of Utah and Mormon history. But from another perspective, from a presentist perspective, inside the culture, she could be regarded as one of the villains because she told a story that didn't need to be told. Now, at the lecture back in March, I had, and you'll see it in the article when it comes out in the quarterly, you'll see her inscription to Apostle Delbert Stapley explaining why she wrote the book. It's a really good comment, probably the best comment I ever saw on why she wrote the story. But the two friends became, as much as anything, representatives of this new approach to history and the new approach to the past. Now, was it perfect? No. And it was not all one way or the other, as I emphasized the past. One more. I think this may be the end. Okay? Both of them were interested in truth. Both of them were interested in fact. But fact and truth vary depending on the perspective that you're looking at them. There's perspective. Okay? So, both of them were telling Latter-day Saint and Latter-day Saint history, but doing so from a new view, a new direction, a new approach on that. These are my thanks, and then one more in the end. Okay, that's pretty much it. Questions? What would you like to ask? Yes, ma'am.
What's the difference between Bagley's more recent book on Mountain Meadow and Juanita's?
Well, you could ask him. He's sitting behind you.
Well, I'm asking you as a
You're asking me? Well, Will's alive and Juanita's not. I guess you could say it that way. Like any pioneer, pioneers always take the first path through things. They're going to miss stuff. That's just the nature of being a pioneer. Juanita's book is open to criticism because she misses some very important facts, and she soft pedals a number of things. Again, given the context of her time, it was perfectly reasonable for her to do so. She was worried about what would happen to her as a Latter-day Saint when she published that book, because she knew exactly what had happened to a friend of hers, a woman by the name of Fawn Brody, when she wrote a book that didn't square with things. However, there was a change. There was a change in approach that happened within the church between 1945 with Brody's book and 1950 with Brody's book, or with Brooks's book. And if anybody's interested, that's the subject of my Mormon History Association talk in spring. There really is a sea change of happening. And part of the problem is the idea of documentation. Juanita was the first person to really document a work. Now, Will has gone way further than Morgan and Brooks ever did. in telling the story. He links it to some much broader things that are going on. They're similar in approach. I think Will's a little harsher. A little more plain-spoken, let's put it that way. He doesn't soft pedal stuff the way Juanita did. So that would be my view of the difference between the books. They're more similar than they are dissimilar.
What was the nature of the friendship between Brooks and Brody? Did they write a lot of letters or?
Oh yeah, in fact,
I haven't heard much about it.
Yeah.
They meet.
Well, wait for the biography; it's coming.
Oh.
Dale made No Man Knows My History relevant. Brody had written, as Dale described it, a polemic, and he saw the manuscript twice completely, and we have in his typewritten, I guess can't say handwritten, but his typewritten notes of how she needed to change and approach the topic differently. Now, Brody was a very good writer. She had a native ability, just like Brooks had a native ability. But the criticism that made both books relevant was Dale Morgan. By the way, Morgan was also the one who corrected the proofs for Desert Saints by Nels Anderson, Mormon Country by Wallace Stegner. Let's see, the 1846 book Kingdom. No, what's the Devoto's book? What's the title?
Year of Decision.
Year of Decision. He critiqued Year of Decision and supplied data to all of them. Dale Morgan was the linchpin around which what was called the lost generations turned. He was the one common thing to every one of them. Anybody else?
So I teach 7th grade Utah history,
Oh yeah.
and we really struggled with mid-century Utah history.
Mm-hmm.
How would you go about adding that? Because our textbook has 4 pages from World War II to the Olympics.
Mm-hmm.
And we just really struggled with that mid-century.
Well, as someone who lived at least 2 of those pages, how would you approach it? I would probably toss out the idea of different ways of storytelling. That's something those kids know. Ask them to interview 2 different people from sides of the family or from sides of a conflict, and ask them why are stories different, and let them tease through the idea of perspective and memory and documentation and those kinds of things. Those are things that they can work with.
Perfect. I just have a project idea.
Good.
Have them imagine a world without screens.
Oh,
Yeah.
most 7th graders struggle.
Watching TV cover.
You mentioned Vesta Crawford, and nobody talks about Vesta
Nope.
Crawford. But I didn't realize, I guess, that she and Juanita were close friends. I only talked to her a few times before she died, but she gave up. She and Faye Ellerton were doing a biography of Emma Smith, and they gave up, and I never could figure out why. Do you know?
I have a suspicion. I can't tell you why specifically. Part of it was that her husband, Arthur, was in state government, and they did not want to put him in a position that would be compromising. 1950, you have to remember, 1950s, Ernie Wilkinson, David O. McKay, and who was the third one, would sit down at breakfast in downtown. Who was it?
Jack Gallup.
Yeah, Jack Gallivan. He was the third one. Would sit down at breakfast informally and basically run the state. That was just the way things worked. So there was the culture was not going to give up easily on its affirming positive pioneer history. This was the heyday of the Daughters of Utah Pioneers. And excuse me for all those if I've just offended. But Kate Carter made a statement. In fact, she said it at BYU. She said, somebody asked her once, what's editing? And she says, I will never let anything go out that is repetitive in a diary or questions my church. And if it ever happened, I would hope I would lose my position. That's a very different perspective than Morgan's view of you take every jot and tittle, every character off of a page to duplicate and reprint. You make as close to the original source as humanly possible. And he was very good at it. He wasn't perfect, but he was very good at it. So his approach was a very, very radical. And I didn't talk much about the whole side of documentary. That's really the thing that shifted Morgan's attention. 1929, a British writer came up with this idea of a different way of storytelling. And it was during the WPA period that documentary became a new form of narrative in the United States, where you don't concentrate on elites like church leaders or national leaders. They'd already been discredited during the Depression, where they failed to act to save the country. Documentary looks at common people, at routine experiences, and it says, what can we learn from that? That stands direct opposite, almost, with the master narrative that says, Brigham Young personally and solely led the entire westward migration. Yeah, well, it didn't happen quite that way. So documentary was another big, that's what I forgot to put into this one. Well?
How do you see Juanita Brooks's perspective on Brigham Young?
Oh, you just want me to quote that one great phrase. Juanita Brooks got into a discussion with Kate Carter one time and reportedly said, as they were talking about Brigham and his colonizing, Juanita was furious that Young would dispatch people down into the deserts with no preparation and virtually no support. And her quip was, you can defend Brigham Young if you want to, but I won't. And she left it at that. You had your hand up.
You started with the concept of heroism, and that sometimes implies personal risk. I can imagine in our contemporary culture, someone making that kind of a challenge would receive death threats, personal death threats.
Mm-hmm.
You know if Juanita ever did?
She got some pretty pointed letters. I don't think she ever got a death threat per se. But she had people that would...
now that can provide for that.
Yeah, right. There were people who would no longer speak to her. Questioning what I remember, okay, here's a personal story. I'm a young married guy living in Bountiful, Utah in 1988. My home teaching companion is from St. George. We go someplace and somebody, this is way before I got seriously into history, my home teaching companion fields a question from somebody that talks about the Mountain Meadows Massacre, and he launches into this long tirade of every story that could possibly, every exculpatory story for why this immigrant company had to be exterminated. Because that's what had been handed down family, but that was their justification for trying to understand why their great-great-grandfather did something that was unspeakably unconscionable. They defended themselves by telling a myth, an origin story that gave them that was relevant to them. Okay, so I don't think Juanita ever got a death threat, but there were people who no longer spoke with her in St. George.
I was quite good friends with Carl Brooks, the mayor of, and her son.
Yep.
And he invited me. He knew I was interested in Utah history. And so when they had the groundbreaking, so to speak, or the dedication of the new monument, when you have to climb up and down, I was invited to it, and I didn't get to go. I was out of town or something. When I did, I was horrified that the monument did not say who killed all these people.
Yeah.
I thought it was a great addition that they had their names, their ages, their families, because it personalized who they were, that they were real people, but not one mention. And I was standing there looking at it, and there were tourists from other places who said, but it must be the Indians. They must have been killed by the Indians. When I went back and said to Carl, your mother's rolling in her grave, Carl, that you would support this, think this is wonderful without that. He said to me, well, there's just no need to dig all that up again. It just causes nothing but hard feelings.
Yeah.
And that was, 15 years ago.
Sure.
They were still carrying that feeling, and that was her son. He said, better not to. Since then, they've added
Right.
a narrative as you go up, but those keep getting stolen.
Well, that's a common problem in any park. It's not just that one, but that's the one we pay attention to. Yes, you're right. Memory is a tricky thing. Memory is how we both call back to the present, by the way. That's again, presentism. You bring something back from the past to make it relevant to the now. But it's also subject to the pressures of now. So I remember things that happened in my childhood much differently than my mother, who was standing right beside me. Okay? Perspective, ability, time, all kinds of things like that. Those all go into the idea of memory. And then what use we put to them in the present as well. Any other questions? Brickbats?
Let's thank Richard. Thank you very much.